You should know your place.
No. You should know whose house you're standing in.
Danielle, don't make this worse.
Atlanta moves at its own pace in the early evening. Not the loud version people show on social media. Not the flashy parties or crowded rooftops downtown. The real rhythm of the city settles into quiet neighborhoods where porch lights glow softly and families begin winding down from the day. Buckhead was like that. Wide streets, tall trees leaning over sidewalks, brick homes with windows warm from the last stretch of sunlight before night settles in. Inside one of those homes, Danielle sat on the living room floor with her 2 children. Jordan and Jasmine were 5 years old, twins with matching smiles and the kind of energy that filled every corner of a room. Their toys were scattered across the rug like a colorful storm of plastic blocks. Jordan carefully placed a red block on top of a growing tower. "Don't move," he whispered seriously, holding his breath like a tiny engineer solving an important problem. Jasmine leaned closer, her eyes wide with excitement. "It's gonna fall," she said, already giggling. Danielle rested her chin on her hand, watching them with a soft smile. She loved moments like this. The world outside the house could be complicated. Business meetings, schedules, responsibilities. But down here on the floor with her children, life felt simple again. Jordan placed the final block on top. The tower leaned slightly. Jasmine covered her mouth. For 2 seconds, the tower stood proudly. Then it collapsed. Plastic blocks scattered across the carpet. Jasmine burst into laughter so loud she fell backward on the rug. Jordan groaned dramatically. "I almost had it." Danielle laughed and pulled them both into a quick hug. "You'll get it next time," she said. Jordan crossed his arms like a tiny businessman considering a new strategy. "I need stronger blocks." Jasmine grabbed another handful of pieces and dumped them in front of him. "Try again." Danielle watched them start rebuilding. Outside the tall living room windows, the last light of day stretched across the quiet street. A neighbor walked a dog past the house. Somewhere down the road, faint gospel music drifted from a church rehearsal. It was peaceful, the kind of peace Danielle used to dream about when she was younger, growing up on the south side of Atlanta, back when her mother used to sit on the porch during summer evenings and remind her of something she never forgot. "Money can change where you live," her mother would say, "but it should never change who you are." Danielle had carried that lesson into every part of her life, even into this house. Especially into this house. Jordan looked up suddenly. "Mommy, help me build the base." Danielle scooted closer and began stacking the blocks with him, carefully creating a wider foundation. "There," she said, "stronger." Jasmine clapped her hands proudly, like they had just solved a major problem. The tower began rising again. For a moment, the house felt exactly the way a home should feel. Warm, safe, full of laughter. And then the front door opened. Welcome to Mr. Kingswell Stories, where powerful life lessons are shared through unforgettable storytelling. If you're new here, we're glad to have you. Subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories that motivate, uplift, and open the mind. And while you're here, tell us the time and where you're watching from in the comments. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house. Not loud, but sharp enough to interrupt the small world Jordan and Jasmine had built on the living room floor. Jordan paused, mid-stack. "Daddy's home." Danielle slowly lifted her eyes toward the hallway. For a brief moment, she allowed herself a small hope that tonight might feel normal again. That hope lasted about 2 seconds. Bradley stepped into the living room, wearing a charcoal suit that looked like it had just come from a business meeting. His tie hung loose around his collar, and the confidence he carried into the room filled the space before he even spoke. But he wasn't alone. A woman walked in behind him, tall, polished. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with the steady rhythm of someone used to entering places where she expected attention. Her lipstick was a sharp red that stood out against the neutral colors of the house. Jordan frowned slightly. Children noticed differences quickly. Jasmine looked up from the blocks, her curiosity louder than her voice. "Who's that?" Danielle stood slowly. Bradley barely glanced at the children. His eyes passed over Danielle the same way someone might glance at furniture while walking into a room. "Danielle," he said casually, loosening his tie. "Make us a drink." The sentence landed in the room without warmth. No greeting, no smile, just instruction. The woman beside him stopped a few steps behind Bradley and looked directly at Danielle, not with kindness, with interest, the kind people show when they're studying something unfamiliar. Her gaze moved slowly from Danielle's face, down to the casual clothes she wore while sitting on the floor with the kids, then back up again. Jordan felt the tension before he understood it. He looked at Danielle. "Mommy." Danielle kept her voice calm. "Keep building your tower." Bradley finally gestured lazily toward the woman beside him. "Oh," he added with a short laugh. "This is the wife." The word hung in the air like something disposable. The woman smiled slightly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've just confirmed something they already suspected. Danielle said nothing, and that silence was the first thing in the room that made the woman curious. Danielle walked toward the kitchen without saying a word, not because she had to, because she understood something Bradley had forgotten a long time ago. Noise isn't always strength. Sometimes silence carries more weight than shouting ever could. Behind her, Jordan carefully stacked another block, but he kept glancing toward the hallway where Bradley and the woman had moved into the living room. Jasmine leaned close to him. "Is she Daddy's friend?" She whispered. Jordan didn't answer. He was watching his mother. Children often read a room better than adults. In the kitchen, Danielle placed 2 glasses on the counter and reached for a bottle. Her hands moved steadily, but her mind was racing through memories she had pushed aside for months. Late nights when Bradley didn't come home, the unfamiliar perfume on his jackets, the growing distance in his voice whenever he spoke to her. For a long time she had told herself it was stress, success, changing their schedule, pressure from investors. But standing there now, hearing the soft laughter drifting from the living room, Danielle finally stopped pretending she didn't understand what was happening inside her own home. She carried the drinks back toward the living room. Jordan looked up. "Mommy, who's that lady?" Danielle crouched beside him for a moment. Her voice stayed gentle. "Just a guest." Across the room, Bradley dropped into the couch like a man who owned everything around him. The woman sat beside him, crossing her legs comfortably. When Danielle placed the drinks on the table, the woman stood up slowly. Her heels tapped softly against the floor as she walked closer. Too close. She studied Danielle's face, the way someone studies a painting in a gallery. Curious, judging, testing. "So," the woman said slowly, "you're the wife who just stays quiet." Jordan stopped touching the blocks. Jasmine looked up from the floor. The entire room felt different now. Danielle held the woman's gaze calmly. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. She didn't even step back. And that was the moment something shifted. Because silence like that doesn't come from weakness. It comes from someone who knows something other people don't. The woman tilted her head slightly, still studying her. Bradley chuckled from the couch, but neither of them understood the truth sitting quietly in front of them. Danielle wasn't staying silent because she was powerless. She was silent because she was watching, and sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't rush to speak. The woman's question still hung in the air. "You're the wife who just stays quiet." Danielle held her gaze for a moment longer before turning slightly toward the kitchen again. "Excuse me," she said calmly. Not defensive, not apologetic, just calm. She walked back into the kitchen while the sound of Bradley's laughter followed her like something sticky that refused to wash off. Inside the kitchen, Danielle placed her hands on the marble counter and exhaled slowly. This house had always been beautiful. Everyone who visited said the same thing. Tall windows, bright open rooms, marble floors that reflected the afternoon sun like polished glass. The kind of home people slowed their cars to admire while driving past. Bradley loved the house. To him, it was proof that he had become someone important. But to Danielle, the house sometimes felt like a museum built around memories that didn't exist anymore. Because the man laughing in the living room was not the same man she once believed in, not even close. Years earlier, before the house, before the investors, before the expensive suits, Bradley had been very different. Back then, he used to sit at a small kitchen table in their old apartment with a second-hand laptop that sounded like it was struggling just to stay on. He had ideas, big ideas, sometimes too big. Danielle would come home late from work and find him still sitting there, typing, researching, sketching ideas onto scrap paper. "You should get some sleep," she used to tell him. Bradley would shake his head with the energy of someone chasing something just beyond his reach. "If this works," he would say, "everything changes for us. Us Back then, that word meant something. Danielle believed in that dream more than anyone else did. Banks certainly didn't. The first time Bradley applied for a startup loan, the bank manager barely looked at his proposal before declining. Too risky, too ambitious, no collateral. Bradley tried 3 more banks. Each answer was the same: no. That night, Bradley sat on the couch in their apartment staring at the rejection emails on his laptop. Danielle remembered the look on his face. Not anger, disappointment. The quiet kind that makes a person question whether they should keep trying. She sat beside him and closed the laptop gently. "How much do you need?" she asked. Bradley looked confused. "What do you mean?" Danielle already knew the answer. Her father had left her a modest inheritance when he passed away. Money she had never touched. Money she had always considered a safety net. But safety means different things, depending on what you believe in. "If the banks won't fund you," she said, "I will." Bradley stared at her. "You'd invest that?" Danielle nodded. "I believe in you." That moment changed everything. The company that would eventually turn Bradley into a celebrated tech entrepreneur began with Danielle's money, but the investment wasn't careless. Danielle had grown up watching strong women protect their futures carefully. Her mother used to repeat one lesson more than any other: "Money changes your address, baby, but it should never change your soul." Danielle carried that lesson into the investment meeting. Instead of trusting Bradley alone, she consulted a small legal advisor first. The lawyer asked her a simple question: "Do you want to be publicly involved in the company or remain a silent investor?" Danielle thought about Bradley, his pride, his ambition, his need to feel like the builder of something great. "Silent," she answered. The lawyer nodded. That decision would quietly shape the future of the company. Documents were prepared, ownership shares structured, legal protections written carefully into the agreement. Bradley didn't read most of it, not because he didn't trust Danielle, because he trusted her completely. When she handed him the documents to sign, he barely skimmed the pages. "You handle the complicated stuff better than I do anyway," he said with a grin. Danielle smiled and pointed to the signature line. "Just sign." He did, without questions, without hesitation. At the time it felt like trust. Now it felt like a forgotten detail that might eventually matter more than Bradley ever realized. Back in the present, Danielle lifted 2 glasses from the kitchen counter. From the living room, she could still hear Bradley talking loudly, telling the woman stories about his success. "I built the whole thing from scratch," he was saying proudly. Danielle paused for a moment before walking back toward the room, because the truth was more complicated than that. Bradley had built the company's operations, but the foundation? That came from someone he had slowly stopped seeing. Danielle stepped back into the living room. Jordan and Jasmine were still on the floor with their blocks, but they weren't laughing anymore. They were listening. Children always listen when adults think they aren't. Bradley was leaning back comfortably on the couch, while the woman beside him looked around the house with open admiration. "This place is incredible," she said. Bradley smiled proudly. "Yeah," he said. "Everything you see here belongs to me." Danielle placed the drinks on the table without reacting, but Jordan looked up at her, just for a second, and in that second, Danielle understood something clearly. This house didn't feel like home anymore, not because of the walls, not because of the money, because the man sitting on that couch had slowly turned their life into something unfamiliar. And Bradley didn't even realize it. The evening moved forward, but the warmth that had filled the living room earlier never returned. Jordan tried to rebuild the block tower again, yet his attention kept drifting toward the couch where Bradley sat laughing with the woman. Jasmine placed another blue block into Jordan's hand. "You forgot this one," she said. Jordan added it to the base, without speaking. Danielle noticed the change in them immediately. Children may not fully understand adult problems, but they always feel when the air inside a home becomes heavy. Bradley lifted his glass and leaned back against the couch. "You should see the new office downtown," he was telling the woman proudly. "The boardroom alone is bigger than most apartments in this city." The woman laughed softly. "I'm not surprised," she replied. "You seem like a man who enjoys winning." Bradley smiled in a way Danielle hadn't seen in years. It wasn't the smile of the man who once stayed up late chasing ideas at a small kitchen table. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed being admired. Danielle quietly began clearing the dishes from the coffee table. The woman watched her again, that same curious expression still resting on her face, like she was trying to understand how someone could remain so calm while standing inside a situation like this. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became clearer. The woman began appearing more often. Sometimes Bradley would arrive home late, and she would already be with him. Other nights he would bring her after dinner, walking into the house like it was the most normal thing in the world. At first, Jordan and Jasmine didn't say much. They simply watched. One afternoon, Jordan stood beside the front window while Danielle prepared snacks in the kitchen. A black car pulled into the driveway. Jordan's shoulders stiffened slightly. "Mommy," he called quietly. Danielle walked over and looked through the window. Bradley stepped out of the car. The woman followed him. Jordan looked up at Danielle. "That lady again?" Danielle nodded slowly. "Yes." Jordan didn't say anything else, but his small hand tightened around the toy car he was holding. Jasmine wandered into the hallway moments later. "Are we having visitors?" she asked. Danielle knelt beside her and brushed a curl away from her face. "Just guests," she answered gently. The front door opened. Bradley walked in mid-conversation with the woman. "I'm telling you," he said, "this city runs on connections. Once people know your name, doors start opening everywhere." He stopped when he noticed Danielle standing near the kitchen. "Oh, good," he said casually. "Can you make us something to drink?" Danielle didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched him for a moment. There had been a time when Bradley walked into a room and kissed her first before doing anything else. Now he barely looked at her. She walked to the kitchen quietly. The woman followed Bradley into the living room and began looking around again. Jordan and Jasmine sat close together on the floor. The woman smiled politely at them. "Hi there," she said. Jasmine gave a small wave. Jordan didn't. He just watched. Bradley dropped into the couch again and loosened his tie. "You get used to this lifestyle after a while," he said proudly. "Travel, business dinners, networking events. It's a different world." The woman nodded slowly. "I can see why people admire you." From the kitchen, Danielle could hear every word. She placed glasses on a tray, but her attention wasn't on the drinks. It was on the details Bradley seemed to forget mattered. Receipts, company expense reports, transfers from corporate accounts. Over the past few months, Danielle had started noticing patterns. At first, she told herself it was nothing, but the numbers told a different story. Expensive restaurants listed as client meetings, luxury hotel bookings labeled business travel, and several payments tied directly to events Bradley attended with the woman now sitting comfortably in the living room. Danielle never confronted him about it. Instead, she began saving copies quietly, emails, invoices, financial summaries, not because she wanted revenge, because she understood the importance of protection. When you build something from the ground up, you learn quickly that success attracts risk, and Bradley had started making decisions that ignored those risks entirely. Danielle carried the drinks back into the living room. The woman accepted her glass without thanking her. Instead, she looked directly into Danielle's eyes again, still studying, still testing. "You're very calm," she said. Danielle placed the tray down. "I don't see a reason not to be." Bradley chuckled. "That's Danielle," he said casually. "She's always been like that." The woman tilted her head slightly. "Really?" Bradley nodded. "Quiet. Doesn't get involved in my business decisions." Danielle said nothing, but that statement stayed in the room longer than Bradley realized, because it wasn't completely true. Danielle had always been involved, just not in ways Bradley ever bothered to notice. Jordan leaned closer to Jasmine and whispered something Danielle couldn't hear. Jasmine looked toward the couch again and frowned slightly. The woman took a sip of her drink. Then her eyes moved back to Danielle. "You must be very patient," she said slowly. Danielle met her gaze calmly. "I believe in understanding situations before reacting to them." The woman smiled again, but this time, the smile carried something different. Challenge. Because people who enjoy pushing boundaries often look for reactions, and Danielle's calm refusal to react made her even more curious. Bradley stretched his arms across the back of the couch comfortably. The house was quiet again, but beneath that quiet, something deeper had started shifting. Jordan and Jasmine could feel it. Danielle could feel it. The woman sensed it too, even if she didn't fully understand what it meant yet, because silence like Danielle's doesn't come from fear. It comes from someone who is watching carefully, learning, waiting. And sometimes, the person who says the least in a room understands the most about what is really happening there. That night the house felt unusually quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way a room becomes quiet when everyone inside it senses something uncomfortable. But no one says it out loud. Jordan and Jasmine sat on the living room rug again, their blocks spread across the carpet just like earlier. But this time, they weren't laughing. They were listening. Bradley sat on the couch with the woman beside him, one arm stretched casually across the back of the cushions. He looked relaxed, too relaxed. The woman had kicked off her heels and curled slightly toward him as they talked. Danielle moved quietly through the kitchen, finishing the last of the dishes from dinner. The soft sound of water running in the sink mixed with Bradley's voice drifting in from the living room. "I'm telling you," Bradley said confidently, "the next phase of the company is going to be huge. Investors are already pushing for expansion." The woman leaned closer. "You must feel unstoppable." Bradley smiled. "That's exactly how it feels." Danielle turned off the faucet and dried her hands slowly. There was a time when Bradley used to include her in those conversations. Back when the company was just an idea sitting on a laptop screen. Back when success was something they imagined together. Now he spoke about it like she had never been part of the journey at all. Danielle stepped into the living room. Jordan immediately looked up. "Mommy, look," he said quietly. He had rebuilt the tower again. This time the base was wider, stronger. Danielle knelt beside him. "That's impressive," she said softly. Jasmine smiled proudly. "We made it better." Danielle kissed the top of Jasmine's head. "Good teamwork." Across the room, Bradley glanced at them briefly before turning his attention back to the woman. "You see?" he said with a shrug. "Domestic life." The woman laughed lightly, but her eyes moved back to Danielle, still curious, still studying. After a moment, she stood up. "I need to stretch," she said casually. Her bare feet touched the marble floor as she walked slowly across the room. Jordan and Jasmine watched her move past them. She stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. Danielle was placing the last glass into the cabinet when she felt the presence behind her. She turned. The woman stood only a few inches away, close enough that Danielle could smell her perfume. The woman crossed her arms and leaned against the kitchen counter. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply looked at Danielle the same way someone examines an object they are trying to understand. "You're interesting," the woman finally said. Danielle closed the cabinet door gently. "I'm not sure what you mean." The woman tilted her head slightly. Most wives would be angry by now. Danielle's expression remained calm. "Anger doesn't always solve problems." The woman gave a short laugh. "That sounds like something people say when they're afraid to confront the truth." Danielle didn't react. From the living room, Jordan's voice drifted into the kitchen. "Mommy." Danielle glanced toward the doorway. "I'm right here," she called gently. The woman noticed the exchange. "You're very composed," she said slowly. Danielle met her eyes. "I prefer peace in my home." The woman studied her a little longer. Then something changed in her expression. A small smile appeared, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile people wear when they want to prove a point. "You know what I think?" she said. Danielle waited. "I think you stay quiet because you know your place." The words hung between them. Danielle still didn't respond. That seemed to irritate the woman more than anything else. Some people push harder when they don't get the reaction they expect. From the couch, Bradley called out lazily, "Everything good in there?" The woman didn't take her eyes off Danielle. "Perfect," she answered. Jordan had walked closer to the kitchen now, standing just outside the doorway. "Mommy." Danielle turned slightly toward him. "It's okay, sweetheart." The woman noticed the child watching. She straightened and stepped closer to Danielle, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "You really don't have anything to say?" she asked. Danielle's voice stayed steady. "There's nothing to say." That answer seemed to snap something inside the woman. Her hand moved suddenly. The sound echoed sharply through the kitchen. A slap. Jordan gasped. Jasmine, who had followed him into the hallway, immediately began crying. Danielle's head turned slightly from the impact. But she didn't fall. She didn't shout. She simply stood there. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound itself. Bradley leaned forward slightly on the couch. Instead of anger, a small laugh escaped him. "Well," he said casually, "guess she had that coming." Jordan stared at his father in confusion. "Daddy," Bradley didn't answer him. Danielle slowly turned her head back toward the woman. Their eyes met again, but something inside Danielle had shifted. Not anger, not humiliation, understanding. She walked past the woman without another word and knelt down beside Jasmine, who was crying softly. "It's okay," Danielle whispered, wiping her daughter's tears. Jordan stood frozen, still trying to understand what had just happened. Danielle took both of their small hands. "Come with me." She didn't look at Bradley. She didn't look at the woman. She simply led Jordan and Jasmine toward the staircase. Behind them, Bradley leaned back against the couch again. "Relax," he told the woman. "She'll get over it." But upstairs, as Danielle guided her children into their bedroom, something inside her had already changed. Not loudly, quietly, like a door closing forever. Jordan looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, why did that lady hit you?" Danielle sat beside them on the bed and brushed Jasmine's hair gently. Her cheeks still felt warm, but her voice was steady. "Sometimes people behave badly when they don't understand respect." Jordan frowned. "Daddy didn't stop her." Danielle paused for a moment. Then she kissed both of them softly on the forehead. "Get some rest." She turned off the bedroom light, and as Danielle walked down the hallway alone, one thought moved clearly through her mind. Some moments break a person, other moments wake them up. And tonight, Danielle had just awakened. Jordan lay on his side staring at the ceiling. The bedroom was dark except for the faint glow of the nightlight shaped like a small moon near the wall. Jasmine had already curled up under her blanket, but her breathing was uneven. Every few seconds she sniffled quietly. Danielle sat on the edge of the bed, gently brushing Jasmine's hair with slow, steady strokes. Neither child spoke for a while. The silence in the room felt fragile. Finally, Jordan broke it. "Mommy." Danielle turned slightly. "Yes, sweetheart." Jordan hesitated. Children sometimes struggle to ask questions when they sense the answers might hurt. Why didn't Daddy stop her? The words hung in the room. Danielle felt the weight of them. Immediately, she could lie. She could invent a gentle excuse. But children remember the way adults answer questions like that. So Danielle chose her words carefully. "Sometimes people forget what respect looks like," she said softly. Jordan frowned. "But Daddy knows you." Danielle nodded slowly. "Yes." Jordan thought about that for a moment. Then he said something quietly that made Danielle's chest tighten. "You didn't do anything wrong." Danielle leaned forward and kissed his forehead. "Thank you." Jasmine shifted under the blanket. "Is she coming back?" she asked sleepily. Danielle pulled the blanket a little higher around her daughter. "No," she said gently. "Not tonight." The children finally began to settle. Jordan's eyes slowly closed. Jasmine's breathing softened. Danielle stayed there a little longer, watching them. Her cheeks still stung faintly, but the physical pain wasn't what mattered. What stayed with her was Jordan's question. Why didn't Daddy stop her? Danielle stood quietly and walked toward the bedroom door. Before turning off the light, she looked back once more at the two small shapes sleeping under their blankets. They deserved a peaceful home. They deserved safety. They deserved parents who protected them. Danielle closed the door softly behind her. The hallway was quiet. Downstairs she could hear Bradley's voice again, laughter. The woman's voice followed. They sounded relaxed, like nothing important had happened. Danielle walked past the staircase, not toward the living room, toward the small office at the end of the hallway. The room had once been Bradley's workspace when the company was still new. Now Danielle used it more often than he did. She stepped inside and closed the door. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the wooden surface. Danielle sat down and opened her laptop. For a moment she simply stared at the screen, not thinking about Bradley, not thinking about the woman, thinking about the company. The company had started as an idea, a risky one. But Danielle had always believed ideas needed structure to survive, which was why she had insisted on organizing the legal foundation carefully when she invested her inheritance. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. Folders opened, financial reports appeared, email archives, investment agreements, documents Bradley had not looked at in years. The clock on the wall ticked quietly as Danielle worked. 10 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. She reviewed every document with the same focus she once used when helping Bradley plan the company's early strategy. Every signature, Every clause, every legal structure. 3 hours passed. Downstairs, the house had grown silent. Bradley and the woman had either left or fallen asleep. Danielle barely noticed. Her attention stayed fixed on the documents filling the screen. Finally, she stopped scrolling. Her eyes settled on a section of the original investment agreement, a detail many people would overlook. But Danielle had never overlooked it. The ownership structure. Her name appeared beside a specific clause regarding majority voting shares. Danielle leaned back slightly in her chair. She had known this arrangement existed, but seeing it again now, after everything that had happened that night, changed the way it felt. The company Bradley bragged about, the company he claimed belonged entirely to him, legally. It didn't. Danielle closed the document slowly. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the laptop. Humiliation had filled the house earlier that night, but sitting there now, Danielle felt something very different. Clarity, because Bradley believed power came from attention, from money, from being the loudest voice in the room. But real power often sits quietly in the background, waiting. Danielle looked at the clock. Nearly 3 in the morning. She closed the laptop gently, and for the first time since the slap in the kitchen, she allowed herself a small breath of calm, not because the situation was over, because she finally understood it completely. The house was completely still. Danielle remained seated at the desk long after closing her laptop, her eyes resting on the dark screen that now reflected a faint image of her face. It was almost 4 in the morning. The quiet felt different now. Earlier that night, the silence had carried humiliation. Now, it carried something steadier, understanding. Danielle opened the laptop again, not out of doubt, out of discipline. When something important appears in a legal document, you don't trust your memory, you confirm it. The folder containing the original company formation files opened slowly on the screen. Some of the documents were nearly a decade old. Contracts, investment agreements, ownership filings. The digital timestamps showed dates from years earlier, when Bradley had been sitting at a small apartment table chasing an idea nobody else believed in. Danielle opened the main investment agreement again. Her eyes moved directly to the section that mattered most. The structure had been written carefully. The legal advisor she consulted back then had been thorough. Danielle could still remember that afternoon clearly. They had sat across from each other in a small office with stacks of paperwork spread across a wooden desk. The lawyer had studied Danielle for a moment before asking his first real question. "You're funding the company personally?" Danielle nodded. "Yes." "And Bradley will operate it?" "Yes." The lawyer leaned back slightly in his chair. "That creates an important decision for you." Danielle waited. "Do you want to be publicly involved in the company's leadership?" he asked, "or remain a silent investor with ownership protection?" Danielle thought about Bradley, his ambition, his pride, the way he talked about building something from nothing. If she appeared publicly as the financial backbone of the company, Bradley might feel overshadowed. She didn't want that, not back then. "He should run it," Danielle said. "That's his strength." The lawyer nodded slowly. "In that case," he said, "you can remain a silent investor while holding majority voting shares." Danielle had asked a simple question. What does that mean exactly? The lawyer folded his hands on the desk. "It means Bradley can run the company day to day. He can operate as CEO, represent the company publicly, make business decisions." Danielle listened carefully. "But the majority ownership," the lawyer continued, "would legally belong to you." Danielle had paused at that moment. Would he know? The lawyer answered honestly. "He will see it in the paperwork. But many founders don't pay attention to those sections if they trust the investor." Danielle remembered thinking about Bradley's personality. Back then he trusted her completely. "Structure it that way," she said. The lawyer nodded. "And the documents were created." Back in the present, Danielle scrolled slowly through the pages again. There it was. Clear, legally binding. Majority voting control, Danielle. Operational leadership, Bradley. At the time, the arrangement felt like protection for their shared future. Now, it looked like something else entirely. A safeguard Bradley had never bothered to understand. Danielle opened another folder. Financial summaries, company expense records, recent travel reimbursements. The pattern she noticed earlier was impossible to ignore now. High-end restaurants, luxury hotel bookings, large expenses listed under vague descriptions like client engagement. But Danielle recognized the dates. Several matched nights Bradley had come home late, with the smell of unfamiliar perfume on his jacket. Others matched evenings when he had brought the woman into the house. Danielle didn't feel anger as she reviewed the numbers. She felt confirmation. The situation wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural. She closed the financial folder and leaned back again. The sun was beginning to rise outside the window, casting a pale orange glow over the quiet neighborhood. Danielle rubbed her eyes for a moment before opening her email. There were 2 names she searched for immediately: board members, people who had been involved in the company long enough to understand its foundation. She selected the first address. Her fingers paused above the keyboard briefly, not because she was unsure, because she understood the weight of what she was about to do. Danielle began typing. Her message was calm and precise. No accusations, no emotional language, only facts, attached documents, financial summaries, ownership structure clarification. When the email was finished, she read it once carefully before sending it. Then she opened a second message. The same documents, the same explanation. Another board member who had always valued accountability. Danielle pressed send again. 2 quiet emails. That was all. She closed the laptop slowly. Downstairs, the house remained silent. Bradley had no idea what had begun during the night. He believed the most important moment of that evening had been the slap in the kitchen. But Danielle understood something different. The real turning point had happened later, in a quiet room, with legal documents open on a laptop screen, because power rarely announces itself loudly. Most of the time it sits quietly inside paperwork that people assume isn't important. Danielle stood up from the desk and walked toward the window. The morning light spread slowly across the neighborhood. A few early commuters were already pulling out of their driveways. Another normal day was beginning, and somewhere across the city, the company Bradley loved to brag about was preparing for its next board meeting. Bradley believed he controlled that company, but the documents sitting in Danielle's email attachments told a very different story, and soon, other people would be reading them too. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. On the surface, nothing had changed inside the house. Bradley still walked through the front door each evening with the same confidence that had filled his voice for months. His phone rang constantly with calls from investors, reporters, and business contacts who wanted to be associated with the company's success. But Danielle noticed something different, not about Bradley, about herself. She was no longer reacting to his behavior emotionally. She was observing it, the same way someone studies a situation they already understand. One morning, a few days later, Bradley stood in front of the large television mounted on the living room wall while adjusting his tie. A business news channel was airing an interview he had recorded the previous week. The host on the screen smiled as she spoke. Bradley has become one of the most talked about tech entrepreneurs in Atlanta this year. His company's rapid growth has caught the attention of investors across the country. Jordan sat cross-legged on the floor watching the screen. Jasmine leaned against Danielle on the couch. Bradley looked pleased. "You see that?" he said proudly. "They're finally recognizing what we built." Danielle watched quietly. On the television, Bradley spoke confidently about innovation, leadership, and bold decision-making. He described the company as something he had built from nothing. Jordan tilted his head slightly. "Mommy." Danielle looked down at him. "Yes?" Jordan pointed toward the television. "Did Daddy build the company by himself?" Danielle paused for a moment before answering. "Your father had an idea," she said gently. "Ideas are important." Jordan seemed to consider that answer. Bradley turned away from the television and grabbed his car keys from the table. "I've got meetings all day," he said. "Big investors in town." Then he walked toward the front door. Just before leaving, he glanced back briefly. "Try to keep the house quiet today. I'll probably bring someone by tonight." The door closed behind him. Jasmine looked up at Danielle. "Is the lady coming again?" Danielle brushed a hand through her daughter's hair. "I don't know." But she suspected the answer. Later that afternoon, Danielle sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open again. The financial reports she had reviewed earlier continued updating automatically through the company's internal systems. Danielle scanned the newest entries carefully. More expenses appeared. Restaurant charges, transportation costs, a luxury hotel reservation listed under executive client hospitality. Danielle recognized the date immediately. It matched a night Bradley had never come home. She clicked into the detailed record. The payment had been approved through Bradley's executive account. Corporate funds, used casually, used carelessly. Danielle didn't react. She simply saved another copy of the record. Across the city, Bradley was enjoying the attention that success attracts. At a private restaurant downtown, he sat at a long table with several investors and business partners. The woman sat beside him again, her presence drawing curious glances from others at the table. Bradley didn't hide the attention he gave her. He spoke loudly, laughed easily, and told stories about the company's rapid growth. One of the investors raised his glass. To Bradley, he said, "The man who built this company faster than anyone expected." Glasses lifted around the table. Bradley smiled broadly. "Just getting started," he replied. Across the room, a television screen displayed a short segment about the company's latest expansion plans. The caption beneath Bradley's face read, "Founder and CEO." Bradley leaned back in his chair comfortably. The title suited him. What he didn't see were the quiet conversations happening in other places. Inside two separate offices across the city, the board members Danielle had emailed were reviewing the documents she sent: financial records, expense reports, ownership agreements. They didn't respond immediately, but they read carefully. Because in the world of corporate leadership, documentation carries more weight than reputation. That evening, Bradley returned home later than usual. Jordan and Jasmine were already upstairs getting ready for bed. Danielle sat at the dining table reviewing another file when the front door opened. Bradley walked in, alone this time. He tossed his jacket across the back of a chair. "Busy day," he said. Danielle closed the laptop slowly. "I imagine—" Bradley poured himself a drink from the cabinet. "You wouldn't believe the opportunities coming our way," he said confidently. "The board meeting next week is going to be huge." Danielle watched him carefully. "What kind of changes are you planning?" Bradley took a sip of his drink. "Leadership adjustments," he said casually. "Some people aren't keeping up with the company's direction." Danielle understood exactly what he meant. Bradley believed he was the most important person in the company. He believed the board meeting would reinforce that belief. Danielle stood up and walked toward the hallway. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused. Then she turned slightly toward him. "You should read every document before you sign anything tomorrow," she said calmly. Bradley laughed, not kindly, more like someone hearing an unnecessary suggestion. "I don't need legal advice," he said. He lifted his glass slightly. "I built that company." Danielle held his gaze for a moment. Her expression remained steady. Then she nodded once and continued upstairs toward the children's room. Bradley didn't notice the quiet certainty in her eyes. But if he had, he might have realized something important. The most dangerous mistake a powerful person can make is assuming they understand the rules of a game they never bothered to read. The morning of the board meeting began like any other day in Buckhead. Soft sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the house, stretching across the marble floors in long, quiet lines. Danielle stood in the kitchen pouring orange juice into 2 small glasses. Jordan sat at the table swinging his legs slightly, while Jasmine focused carefully on spreading jam across a slice of toast. Children have a way of treating ordinary mornings like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. Jordan looked up. "Mommy, do you have work today?" Danielle placed the glasses in front of them. "Yes," she said gently. "I have a meeting." Jasmine took a bite of toast. "Is Daddy going too?" Danielle paused for a brief moment before answering, "Yes." Upstairs, a door closed. Bradley walked down the staircase a few seconds later, wearing a dark blue suit that looked freshly pressed. His confidence entered the room before he even spoke. Today mattered to him, not because he expected conflict, because he expected recognition. Bradley believed the board meeting would be another opportunity to demonstrate his authority over the company he loved to call his creation. He poured himself coffee without sitting down. "Big day," he said casually. Danielle glanced at him. "Yes." Bradley smirked slightly. "The board's been asking for leadership adjustments," he said. "Today, we finally cleaned things up." Jordan looked between them, sensing something serious in the tone of their voices. "Are you fighting?" he asked. Bradley laughed. "No, buddy," he said. "Just business." Danielle placed a hand gently on Jordan's shoulder. "Finish your breakfast." Bradley checked the time on his watch. "I'm heading in early," he said. Then he grabbed his car keys from the counter. As he walked toward the door, he paused briefly and looked back at Danielle. You should come to the meeting, he added. Danielle held his gaze. I will. Bradley smiled slightly. Good, he said. You'll see how real decisions get made. The front door closed behind him. A few minutes later, Danielle helped Jordan and Jasmine gather their school bags. When the school car arrived, the children ran toward it with the simple excitement of another normal day. Danielle watched them leave before returning inside. She walked upstairs to the bedroom and opened the closet. Instead of choosing anything flashy, she selected a simple tailored suit, professional, quiet, confident, the same way she intended to carry herself in the meeting. On the dresser sat a thin folder. Inside were copies of the documents she had reviewed several nights earlier. Ownership agreements, financial records, email confirmations. Danielle picked up the folder and held it for a moment. Then she walked out of the house. Downtown Atlanta was already busy by the time Bradley arrived at the company headquarters. The building stood tall among the other glass towers that shaped the city's skyline. Employees moved through the lobby carrying laptops and coffee cups while security greeted them at the front desk. Bradley walked through the entrance like a man who owned the entire building. Several employees nodded respectfully as he passed. Morning, Bradley. Morning. The elevator ride to the top floor took less than 30 seconds. When the doors opened, the hallway leading to the boardroom was already active. Assistants moved quickly between offices, preparing reports and presentations. Bradley stepped into the boardroom early. The space was exactly the kind of room he loved. A long, polished table sat at the center, surrounded by tall chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city stretching in every direction. From this height, Atlanta looked powerful. Bradley placed his tablet on the table and reviewed his notes. He had prepared several statements for the meeting. Plans for expansion, leadership, restructuring, a few bold decisions he intended to present as necessary for the company's future. One of those decisions involved Danielle. Bradley leaned back in his chair for a moment, imagining how the conversation might unfold. He would speak confidently, explain that the company had grown beyond its early stages, explain that certain roles were no longer relevant. He believed the board would support him. Why wouldn't they? He was the face of the company, the founder, the CEO. A few minutes later, the first board members began entering the room. They greeted Bradley politely, but something about their expressions felt slightly reserved. Bradley didn't notice. He was too focused on the moment he had planned. Then the door opened again. Danielle walked in quietly. She carried a simple folder in one hand. No dramatic entrance, no attempt to command attention. She simply took a seat halfway down the table. One of the board members nodded respectfully toward her. Bradley glanced at the folder she placed in front of her. Prepared for the meeting? He asked casually. Danielle met his eyes. Yes. Bradley smiled. Good, he said, because Bradley believed he knew exactly how the meeting would end. What he didn't realize was that the documents sitting inside Danielle's folder were about to change everything. The boardroom slowly filled with quiet movement. Chairs slid softly against the polished floor as board members took their seats around the long table. Laptops opened. Coffee cups were placed beside notepads. Papers shuffled gently. Outside the tall windows, the city stretched wide under the morning sun. But inside the room, the atmosphere felt noticeably heavier. Bradley sat at the head of the table. That position had always belonged to him. He leaned back comfortably, fingers resting loosely on the armrests of the chair, watching the others settle in. Danielle sat halfway down the table with the folder placed neatly in front of her. She didn't open it yet. She simply waited. One of the board members cleared his throat softly. Shall we begin? Bradley leaned forward immediately. Yes, he said confidently. Let's get started. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly toward the center of the room. The movement felt natural to him. This was where he performed best. Public speaking, leadership announcements, moments where everyone else listened while he explained the future. Bradley clasped his hands together briefly. I want to start by saying how proud I am of what this company has accomplished over the past few years, he began. His voice carried easily across the room. When we started, we were just a small idea competing in a crowded market. He smiled slightly. Now we're one of the fastest growing companies in Atlanta. Several board members nodded politely. Bradley continued. Our expansion plans are attracting national attention. Investors are reaching out every week. The opportunities in front of us are enormous. He began pacing slowly beside the table. But growth also means we need to refine our leadership structure. A few board members exchanged quick glances. Bradley didn't notice. In the early days, he said, a lot of people were involved in helping the company get started. His eyes moved briefly toward Danielle. That support was valuable at the time. Danielle remained still. Bradley turned back toward the rest of the room. But this company has reached a stage where only the most relevant voices should influence major decisions. One of the board members shifted slightly in his chair. Bradley kept speaking. Some individuals connected to the company no longer contribute to its direction in any meaningful way. His gaze returned to Danielle again. This time the intention was clearer. The room grew quieter. Bradley rested his hands on the back of his chair. I believe it's time we streamline our leadership. He looked directly at Danielle now. Danielle, he said calmly, your early support helped the company launch. The sentence sounded polite on the surface, but the tone carried dismissal. This company has evolved beyond that stage. Danielle didn't react. Bradley continued speaking as if explaining a simple business decision. You're not involved in the daily operations. You don't participate in strategic planning, and you haven't contributed to executive leadership decisions. He spread his hands slightly. So I think it's reasonable to step back from company matters completely. A long pause followed. Bradley looked around the table expecting agreement. Instead, he noticed something strange. No one responded. A few board members looked down at their notes. Others glanced briefly toward Danielle. Bradley frowned slightly but continued. I propose that we formally remove Danielle from any remaining influence over company decisions. Silence. The quiet felt heavier now. Bradley mistook it for hesitation. He smiled confidently. This isn't personal, he added. It's just about efficiency. Danielle finally moved. Not quickly. She simply opened the folder in front of her. Bradley noticed the movement, but continued speaking. We're entering a stage where leadership must be focused and decisive. Danielle lifted several documents from the folder. Then she gently placed them on the table. The papers slid across the polished surface toward the center. The soft sound of paper against wood caught the attention of everyone in the room. Bradley stopped speaking. What's that? He asked. Danielle's voice remained calm. Documents. Bradley chuckled lightly. We're in the middle of a meeting. Yes, Danielle said. That's why I brought them. One of the board members leaned forward and picked up the first page. Another reached for a second document. Bradley watched them with growing irritation. We can review paperwork later, he said dismissively, but the board members were already reading. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The quiet that followed felt different from before, focused, serious. One board member adjusted his glasses and examined the page more carefully. Another flipped through several pages. Bradley crossed his arms. What exactly are you trying to show here? Danielle folded her hands calmly in front of her. I thought it would be useful for everyone to review the original company investment agreement. Bradley frowned. Why? Danielle didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the table at the board members who were still reading. One of them slowly leaned back in his chair. Another tapped a finger lightly against the document. Bradley's irritation began turning into confusion. Those are old documents, he said. They're not relevant to today's discussion. One board member looked up at him. His expression was careful. Actually, he said slowly, they're very relevant. Bradley's confidence faltered slightly for the first time. What are you talking about? The board member glanced down at the document again before speaking. These are the original ownership agreements from the company's founding. Bradley shrugged. Of course they are. The board member lifted the page slightly. And according to these agreements, he paused. Bradley waited impatiently. The board member looked directly at him. There's something here you should probably read. The room became completely still. Bradley walked toward the table and picked up the document. At first he scanned it quickly, then his eyes slowed. He read the same paragraph again, and then again. His expression began to change, because the words on the page were not what he expected, and the meeting he thought he was controlling was about to take a very different direction. Bradley stood beside the table, holding the document. At first his expression showed mild irritation, then confusion, then something closer to disbelief. He read the paragraph again, his eyes moving slower this time. Across the table, the board members remained silent. Danielle sat calmly with her hands folded. Bradley looked up. This doesn't make sense, he said. No one answered. He looked back down at the page. The section title at the top read clearly, Majority Voting Structure. Bradley skimmed the text again. The language was legal, but the meaning was simple. Majority voting shares, assigned to Danielle. Bradley laughed suddenly. A short, uneasy sound. This must be outdated paperwork, he said. Something from the early days before everything was restructured. One of the board members leaned forward slightly. There was no restructuring of the ownership agreement, he said. Bradley frowned. Of course there was. The board member shook his head. No. Bradley flipped to another page. His own signature stared back at him. He flipped again. Another page. Another signature. His. The room remained silent, except for the faint rustling of paper. Bradley's voice lost some of its confidence. These are old agreements, he said. They don't reflect the current structure of the company. Danielle finally spoke. They do. Bradley turned toward her. What are you talking about? Danielle's voice remained calm. You signed those documents when the company was created. Bradley's jaw tightened. That was years ago. Yes, Danielle said. Bradley held the paper up slightly. You're telling me this says you control the company? One of the board members answered before Danielle could. That is exactly what it says. Bradley stared at him. That's ridiculous. The board member gestured toward the page. The majority voting shares belong to Danielle. Bradley looked back down at the document again. The words were unmistakable. Majority ownership. Danielle. Operational authority granted to Bradley as CEO. Bradley slowly lowered the page. You tricked me, he said. Danielle shook her head once. No. Bradley's voice rose slightly. You buried this in legal language. You had every opportunity to read it, Danielle replied. Bradley took a step toward the table. I trusted you. Danielle met his gaze. Yes. The room was completely silent now. You trusted me, she repeated. The words carried more weight than anger ever could. Bradley looked around the table again. Why didn't anyone bring this up before? One of the board members answered calmly. Because until recently, there was no reason to question the leadership structure. Bradley frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Another board member spoke. The financial records Danielle shared raised serious concerns. Bradley's eyes narrowed. What financial records? The board member tapped the document spread across the table. Corporate expenses connected to personal activity. Bradley felt something shift inside his chest. The room suddenly felt smaller. You're investigating me? He asked. We reviewed the information, the board member said carefully. Bradley turned toward Danielle again. You went behind my back. Danielle didn't raise her voice. I protected the company. Bradley shook his head. This is unbelievable. He pointed at the documents. You expect me to believe that you secretly own the company I built? Danielle's voice stayed steady. You built the operation. She paused. But the company itself was created with my investment. Bradley's anger grew. That money was a loan. No, Danielle said. It was an investment. The board member nearest the window spoke again. The agreement clearly defines it as an investment. Bradley looked from one face to another. No one supported him. No one defended him. He felt the confidence he carried into the room, slowly draining away. So what? He said finally. You're saying she owns more shares than I do? Yes, the board member answered. How much more? The board member turned the page and pointed to the percentage listed beside Danielle's name. Bradley leaned closer. His eyes widened, because the number was not close. It was decisive. Danielle held controlling interest. Bradley stepped back from the table. That can't be right. But the signatures were there. His signature, repeated across multiple pages. He had signed them without reading carefully years ago, back when he trusted Danielle completely, back when he believed the company was something they were building together. Bradley looked at Danielle again. For the first time that morning, his voice sounded uncertain. So what happens now? The board members exchanged a brief glance. One of them cleared his throat. There's another matter we need to address. Bradley frowned. What matter? The board member folded his hands. After reviewing the financial records and the ownership structure, the board held a preliminary vote. Bradley felt his stomach tighten. A vote? Yes. Bradley's voice sharpened. A vote about what? The board member looked toward Danielle briefly, then back at Bradley. the future leadership of the company. Bradley laughed nervously. You can't remove the CEO without my approval. The board member shook his head. Actually, the majority shareholder has that authority. All eyes slowly turned toward Danielle. Bradley followed their gaze. Danielle stood up. The movement was calm, unhurried. She looked directly at Bradley. You humiliated me in our home, she said quietly. Bradley said nothing. You allowed someone to disrespect me in front of our children. The room remained completely still. You used company resources for personal indulgence. Bradley clenched his jaw. Danielle's voice never rose. You forgot something important. Bradley whispered the question before he could stop himself. What? Danielle held his gaze. You forgot who built the foundation under everything you stand on. Bradley felt the last of his confidence collapse. Danielle finished the sentence simply. You're no longer the CEO of this company. Silence filled the boardroom. One of the board members confirmed it quietly. The vote has already been recorded. Bradley stood frozen. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass windows behind him, but the world he believed he controlled had just disappeared, and the woman he thought he could dismiss had been holding the real power all along. The boardroom remained silent. No one moved. Bradley stood beside the table, still holding the document that had quietly dismantled everything he believed he controlled. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlanta skyline looked exactly the same as it had 30 minutes earlier. Traffic moved through the streets. Sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. The city had not noticed the collapse happening inside this room. Bradley looked around the table again. Every face remained serious. No one looked at him with the admiration he had grown used to. No one defended him. For the first time since the company began, Bradley felt completely alone in a room that once belonged to him. His voice came out quieter than before. You can't just take my company. Danielle remained standing at the opposite side of the table. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. It was never only yours, she replied. Bradley shook his head. I built everything. You built the operation, Danielle said. Her voice carried no anger, only certainty. But the foundation came from my investment. Bradley looked toward the board members again. You're really going along with this? One of them answered calmly. The ownership structure gives Danielle final authority. Bradley felt the truth settling in around him. Every decision he had imagined making in this room was suddenly meaningless. He looked back at Danielle. So that's it? Danielle didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow breath and stepped closer to the table. Every board member watched her. The room understood something important. This moment belonged to Danielle, not because she wanted it, because the structure of the company placed it in her hands. She looked directly at Bradley. You humiliated me in our home, she said. Her voice remained steady. You allowed someone to strike me in front of our children. Bradley lowered his eyes briefly. Danielle continued. You treated the company's resources like personal entertainment. She glanced at the documents spread across the table. Those actions damaged more than our family. The board members remained silent, listening. Danielle's voice never rose, but every word carried weight. Trust is the foundation of any company. She looked at Bradley again. And you broke that trust. Bradley's hands tightened slightly around the back of the chair beside him. You're doing this because of one mistake, he said quietly. Danielle shook her head. No. She paused for a moment. This decision comes from a pattern of choices. The room remained completely still. Bradley looked toward the windows for a second. He remembered standing in this room weeks earlier, describing expansion plans and growth strategies. He had believed he was untouchable. Now the reality was sitting in front of him in legal documents and board votes. He turned back toward Danielle. What exactly are you planning to do? Danielle answered calmly. I'm protecting the company. Bradley laughed softly, but there was no humor in the sound. You mean you're taking it? Danielle didn't react to the accusation. She simply spoke clearly. You are removed as CEO, effective immediately. The words settled into the room with quiet finality. No dramatic reaction followed. No raised voices. Just silence. One of the board members nodded slightly. The vote has already been recorded, he confirmed. Bradley stood frozen. The title he had introduced himself with for years was gone. CEO, founder, leader, all replaced by a single reality he had never imagined. Bradley looked at Danielle again. You really planned all of this? Danielle met his gaze calmly. No. She shook her head once. You created the situation yourself. The room remained silent. Bradley slowly placed the document back onto the table. The pages that once meant nothing to him now defined the outcome of his career. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he walked toward the door. No one stopped him, because there was nothing left to debate. And as the boardroom door closed behind him, the echo of that quiet sound carried a simple truth. Bradley's empire had ended in the same place it began, inside a room where he had signed documents he never bothered to read. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. Bradley stood inside the quiet metal box, staring at the glowing numbers above the door as they slowly counted down. 22, 21, 20. Just an hour earlier, he had walked into the building, expecting another routine board meeting. Now every floor the elevator passed felt like another layer of the life he had built slipping away. Bradley loosened his tie slightly. His mind kept returning to the moment Danielle spoke the final sentence. You are removed as CEO. The words had been calm, simple, but they carried more weight than anything he had heard in years. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft chime. The doors slid open. Bradley stepped out into the wide marble entrance of the building. The lobby looked exactly the same as it always did. Employees moved across the polished floor, carrying laptops and coffee cups. Security guards stood near the front desk, greeting visitors. The outside world had not changed, but Bradley knew something had. He walked slowly toward the exit, and then he saw her. The woman stood near the glass entrance doors, scrolling through her phone while leaning against a tall marble column. Her red lipstick and confident posture looked exactly the same as the night she had walked into his house. She looked up when she noticed him approaching. At first she smiled, but the smile faded slightly when she saw his face. What happened? She asked. Bradley didn't answer right away. He ran a hand through his hair. The words felt strange in his mouth. They removed me. The woman frowned. Removed you from what? Bradley looked at her. From the company. For a moment she said nothing. Then her phone vibrated softly in her hand. She glanced down at the screen. Her expression changed. The smile disappeared completely. Several news notifications had appeared at the same time. Headlines were already spreading through business networks. Corporate leadership change. CEO removed after internal review. Ownership structure dispute. The woman read the alerts quickly. Then she looked back at Bradley. This time, her expression carried something different. Distance. You didn't tell me the board was reviewing things, she said. Bradley exhaled slowly. I didn't know they were. She studied his face carefully. Does this mean you're not running the company anymore? Bradley shook his head. No. The woman looked back at her phone again. Another notification appeared. She read it silently. Then she locked the screen and slipped the phone into her purse. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The lobby felt louder now. People walked past them on their way to meetings. A few employees glanced briefly in Bradley's direction before quickly looking away. News spreads fast inside office buildings. Finally, the woman crossed her arms. So what happens now? She asked. Bradley hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead yet. I'll figure it out, he said. The woman nodded slowly, but the confidence she had shown earlier seemed to fade. Well, she said carefully, I actually have somewhere else I need to be. Bradley stared at her. You're leaving? She adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder. I have plans tonight. Bradley watched her expression. There was no concern, no sympathy, just practicality. He suddenly understood something he had ignored for months. Their connection had never been about him. It had been about the life that surrounded him, the expensive dinners, the private events, the reputation that came with success. And now that success had disappeared. The woman glanced once more toward the glass doors. I hope everything works out for you, she said. Then she turned and walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked across the marble floor as she pushed the door open and stepped outside. She didn't look back. Bradley stood in the lobby watching the door close behind her. For the first time since the board meeting ended, the truth of the situation settled fully into his mind. The attention, the admiration, the excitement people showed when he entered a room, none of it had been permanent. Much of it had never been real. Bradley slowly walked toward the glass doors himself. Outside, the busy streets of downtown Atlanta moved forward like nothing important had happened. Cars passed. Pedestrians crossed the street. The city continued its rhythm. But Bradley stood on the sidewalk, realizing something he had ignored for years. The success he believed defined him had disappeared in a single morning, and the people who had once surrounded him were already moving on. The boardroom door closed softly behind Bradley. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet inside the room felt different now, not tense the way it had been during the confrontation, just reflective. The board members remained seated around the long table, looking at the documents spread across its surface. The city skyline stretched wide through the tall windows behind them, sunlight filling the room with steady brightness. Danielle remained standing where she had delivered her final decision. Her hands rested lightly against the edge of the table. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Well," he said gently, "that was not the kind of meeting anyone expected this morning." Another board member nodded slowly. "But it was necessary." Danielle didn't respond immediately. She looked at the empty chair Bradley had occupied earlier. For years, that seat had symbolized authority. Now it was simply another chair in the room. One of the board members turned toward Danielle. "You handled that with a great deal of composure." Danielle gave a small nod. "This company matters," she said quietly. Another board member closed the folder in front of him. "The immediate priority will be stabilizing leadership," he said. Danielle understood. The company would continue. Business always does. Investors expect stability. Employees expect direction. And companies move forward even after dramatic moments. But Danielle also understood something else. Her decision had never been about power. It had been about boundaries. Another board member spoke. "We can schedule a follow-up meeting later this week to discuss the transition plan." Danielle nodded again. "That makes sense." Chairs moved softly as the board members began gathering their materials. Within a few minutes, the room slowly emptied. Laptops closed. Folders were collected. Quiet goodbyes were exchanged. One by one, they walked out into the hallway. Finally, the door closed again. Danielle was alone. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself to exhale slowly. She walked toward the window at the far end of the boardroom. From this height, Atlanta stretched across the horizon in every direction. Cars moved through the streets below, like small threads connecting the city together. Buildings reflected sunlight in wide sheets of glass. Danielle had seen this view many times before, but today it felt different. For years, the company had shaped nearly every part of her life. The late nights, the financial decisions, the careful planning that allowed Bradley's dream to grow into something real. She had believed in that dream once, completely. And standing there now, Danielle realized something surprising. She didn't feel victorious. She felt lighter. The silence in the room gave her space to think about the journey that led here. From the small apartment where Bradley typed ideas into a second-hand laptop, to the house in Buckhead, to this boardroom overlooking the city, the path had been long, and somewhere along the way, Bradley had forgotten the reason they started. Danielle pulled her phone from her purse. A notification appeared on the screen, a message from the school. She opened it. A photo filled the display. Jordan and Jasmine stood side by side in their classroom, smiling widely while holding colorful drawings. Jordan's drawing showed a tall house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. Jasmine's drawing showed a bright yellow sun above a family holding hands. Danielle smiled softly. Those 2 little faces on the screen reminded her of something important. The company had never been the center of her world. Jordan and Jasmine were. Everything she had done over the past several years had been about protecting their future, not protecting Bradley's ego, not protecting an image of success, protecting stability, respect, peace inside their home. Danielle looked out across the city again. Atlanta continued moving with its steady rhythm. Meetings would happen. Business deals would be negotiated. Investors would continue watching the company closely. But Danielle understood something that Bradley had forgotten long ago. Success is not measured only by wealth or influence. It is measured by the kind of life you build for the people who trust you. Her phone screen dimmed as the photo of Jordan and Jasmine faded. Danielle placed the phone back into her purse. For a few seconds, she simply stood there in the quiet room. Then she walked back toward the table and gathered the remaining documents. The folder felt lighter in her hands now, not because the papers weighed less, because the conflict that had surrounded them was finished. Danielle turned off the boardroom lights and walked toward the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she paused briefly. One chapter of her life had closed inside that room, but another chapter was already waiting, and this time the future would be shaped by something far more important than corporate titles: respect, peace, and the two small voices that would be waiting for her when she picked them up from school: Jordan and Jasmine. The most important part of Danielle's life had never been the company she helped build. It had always been the family she was determined to protect. And as Danielle walked down the hallway toward the elevator, the quiet strength that had carried her through every moment of this story remained exactly where it had always been, inside her. The afternoon sun stretched across the parking lot outside the school when Danielle arrived. Children's voices carried across the playground, filling the warm Atlanta air with the familiar sound of laughter and movement. For a moment, Danielle remained inside the car, watching the scene through the windshield. The morning had been heavy: boardroom decisions, corporate consequences, years of tension finally settling into clarity. But the world in front of her looked simple again. Kids running across the grass, backpacks bouncing against small shoulders, teachers standing near the entrance, guiding students toward waiting parents. Danielle stepped out of the car. As soon as Jordan saw her standing near the gate, he raised his hand and waved. "Mommy." Jasmine ran beside him, her small sneakers tapping quickly against the sidewalk. Danielle knelt down just as they reached her. Both children wrapped their arms around her at the same time. "How was school?" Danielle asked. Jordan held up a sheet of paper proudly. "Look what we did today." Jasmine lifted her own paper too. "We drew our family." Danielle smiled and took the drawings. Jordan's picture showed a tall house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. One larger figure in the center, 2 smaller figures holding hands beside it. Jasmine's drawing showed something similar, but she had added a large yellow sun in the corner of the page. Danielle studied the drawings carefully. "What about Daddy?" she asked gently. Jordan looked at his paper for a moment. Then he shrugged slightly. He wasn't in the picture today. Danielle understood the quiet honesty in that answer. Children process change in simple ways. They draw what feels true in the moment. Danielle kissed both of their foreheads. "These are beautiful," she said. They walked together toward the car. Jordan climbed into the back seat first while Jasmine carefully placed her drawing on the seat beside her. "Can we hang them on the fridge?" Jasmine asked. "Of course," Danielle said. The drive home felt peaceful. Jordan talked about a math game his class played. Jasmine described a story their teacher read about animals living in a forest. Normal conversations, normal childhood moments. The house in Buckhead looked exactly the same when they arrived. Tall windows, white walls glowing softly in the afternoon light. But something inside the house had changed. The tension that had once filled the rooms was gone. Danielle unlocked the front door, and the children rushed inside. Jasmine ran straight to the refrigerator with her drawing. Jordan followed, searching for a magnet. Danielle watched them quietly. A few days earlier, this house had felt heavy. Now it felt lighter. Jordan stepped back and examined the drawings hanging side by side. "There," he said proudly. "Now everyone can see them." Danielle smiled. She walked into the kitchen and began preparing a small afternoon snack. The simple routine felt grounding. Peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, 2 small glasses of juice. Jasmine climbed onto a chair at the kitchen table. "Mommy." "Yes? Are we okay?" Danielle paused for a moment before answering. The question carried more understanding than Jasmine probably realized. Danielle sat down beside them. "Yes," she said gently. "We're going to be okay." Jordan looked thoughtful. "Does that mean things will be different?" Danielle nodded slowly. "Some things will." Jasmine tilted her head. "Different good?" Danielle smiled. "Yes, different good." Jordan seemed satisfied with that answer. He grabbed his sandwich and took a big bite. For the rest of the afternoon, the house filled with ordinary life again. Homework at the kitchen table, Jasmine building a small tower with her blocks, Jordan explaining the rules of a new game he learned at school. Danielle moved through the house, listening to the sound of their voices, and for the first time in a long while, peace returned to the home she had worked so hard to protect. Several days passed before Bradley finally called. Danielle saw his name appear on her phone while she was standing in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner. Jordan and Jasmine were in the living room, building another tower with their blocks. The house felt calm again, the kind of calm that returns slowly after tension leaves. Danielle dried her hands and answered the phone. "Hello?" Bradley's voice sounded different, quieter, not the confident tone she had grown used to hearing. "Danielle, can we talk?" Danielle didn't answer immediately. She could hear traffic moving in the background on his side of the call. "About what?" she asked. "Everything," Bradley said. A pause followed. Then he added, "Please." Danielle glanced into the living room, where Jordan and Jasmine were laughing about the tower falling again. Finally, she spoke. "There's a park near the school," she said. "Tomorrow afternoon." Bradley agreed quickly. "I'll be there." The next day the sky over Atlanta was bright and clear. The park sat in a quiet neighborhood, where tall trees provided shade over winding walking paths and wooden benches. Children played near the swings, while parents watched from nearby benches. Danielle arrived first. She sat on one of the benches facing the open grass. A few minutes later, Bradley walked toward her. He looked different, not physically older, but the confidence that once surrounded him like armor was gone. He sat beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They watched a group of children running across the grass, chasing a soccer ball. Finally, Bradley exhaled slowly. "I messed everything up." Danielle kept her eyes on the field. "Yes," she said. Bradley rubbed his hands together nervously. "I thought success meant I had control over everything." Danielle listened quietly. "I thought the company proved I was important," Bradley continued. He shook his head slightly. "I stopped paying attention to the people who helped build it." Danielle turned toward him. "You stopped respecting them." Bradley nodded. "That too." Another moment passed. "I hurt you," he said. Danielle didn't respond right away. The sound of children laughing carried through the park. Then she spoke calmly. "You didn't just hurt me." Bradley looked down. "I know," Danielle continued. "You allowed our children to see something they should never see." Bradley closed his eyes briefly. "That's the part I regret the most." Danielle studied him carefully. For the first time since the board meeting, she believed he truly understood the damage his choices had caused. Bradley leaned forward slightly. "I thought money meant I could do whatever I wanted." Danielle shook her head gently. "Money doesn't reveal strength." She paused before finishing the thought. "It reveals character." Bradley looked out across the park again. "I see that now." A group of children ran past the bench chasing a ball. Jordan and Jasmine would probably enjoy playing here, Danielle thought. Bradley spoke again. "I lost the company," he said quietly. Danielle corrected him calmly. "You lost the position." Bradley looked confused. "The company still exists," she explained. "The work people put into building it still matters." Bradley nodded slowly. "I understand." For a while, neither of them spoke. The conversation had reached the part where honesty replaced arguments. Finally, Bradley turned toward her. "What happens now?" Danielle answered simply, "We move forward." Bradley waited. Separately, she added. He nodded again. "I expected that." Danielle looked back toward the open field. Jordan and Jasmine deserved a stable home. They deserved parents who respected each other, even if they were no longer together. "We will focus on raising them well," she said. Bradley agreed quietly. "I want to be part of their lives." "You should be," Danielle said. Bradley stood slowly from the bench. "I'm sorry," he said again. Danielle believed he meant it. But apologies cannot erase choices. They only acknowledge them. Bradley hesitated for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked toward the path leading out of the park. Danielle remained on the bench, watching the sunlight move through the leaves of the trees. Some chapters in life end painfully, but sometimes those endings make space for something healthier, something calmer, something built on respect. And that was exactly the kind of future Danielle intended to create for Jordan and Jasmine. Several months passed. Atlanta moved through the seasons the way it always does, with warm afternoons slowly giving way to cooler evenings and long golden sunsets. Inside the Buckhead house, the atmosphere had changed completely. The tension that once filled the rooms had faded into something quieter, something healthier. On Sunday evenings, the house became lively again. Danielle had started hosting small dinners the way her mother used to when she was growing up on the south side of Atlanta. Music played softly in the background while the smell of food drifted through the kitchen. Jordan and Jasmine loved those nights. They helped set the table, carefully placing forks and napkins exactly where Danielle showed them. Jordan carried a pitcher of lemonade to the table with serious concentration. Jasmine arranged flowers in a small glass vase she insisted belonged in the center. Danielle stood near the stove stirring a pot while watching them move around the kitchen. Moments like this reminded her of the life she wanted for them, a home filled with warmth, not tension. Jordan looked up suddenly. "Mommy." "Yes? Are we having guests tonight?" Danielle smiled. "Just a few friends." Jordan nodded proudly. "I helped set the table." "I noticed," Danielle said. Jasmine climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs. "Mommy." "Yes, sweetheart." Jasmine tilted her head slightly. "Are you happy?" Danielle paused for a moment. Not because the question was difficult, because it deserved an honest answer. She walked over and sat beside them at the table. "Yes," she said gently. "I am." Jordan looked thoughtful. "Even after everything that happened?" Danielle nodded. "Yes." Jasmine leaned closer. "Why?" Danielle looked at both of them carefully. Children understand truth best when it's simple. "Because I remembered something important," she said. Jordan waited. Danielle continued. "Respect matters more than anything else in a relationship." The children listened quietly. "Money doesn't make a home strong," Danielle explained. "Titles don't make someone important." Jordan frowned slightly. "What does?" Danielle smiled softly. "How people treat each other." Jasmine nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Jordan leaned back in his chair, thinking about the idea. After a moment, he said something that made Danielle smile. "My teacher says respect means treating people the way you want to be treated." Danielle nodded. "Your teacher is right." The front doorbell rang. Jordan jumped from his chair. "I'll get it." Jasmine ran after him. Danielle watched them go with a quiet sense of peace. The house felt alive again, not because of the size of the building or the neighborhood it sat in, because the people inside it cared for one another. Across town, Bradley's life looked very different. The apartment he now lived in was smaller than the house he once shared with Danielle, but it was quiet, simple, the kind of place that gave a person time to think. Bradley had found work again, though not at the level he once held. The business world had moved forward without him. Companies always do. But every few weekends, he spent time with Jordan and Jasmine. Those visits had become the most important part of his life, watching them laugh, helping Jordan with homework, listening to Jasmine describe stories she learned in school. Those moments reminded Bradley of something he had forgotten during the years when success surrounded him. Family cannot be replaced by achievements. One evening after dinner, Danielle and the children sat together in the living room. Jordan had his notebook open on the coffee table. Jasmine colored quietly beside him. Jordan looked up again. "Mommy." "Yes?" "Will we always live here?" Danielle thought for a moment before answering. "Where we live isn't the most important thing." Jordan looked confused. "It isn't?" Danielle shook her head gently. "What matters is how we treat each other wherever we are." Jasmine smiled. "Like respect." "Exactly," Danielle said. The room fell quiet again as the children returned to their drawings. Danielle leaned back against the couch and watched them. Life had changed in ways she never expected, but sometimes change reveals truths that were always waiting to be understood. She had once believed protecting the company was the most important responsibility she carried. Now she understood something deeper. The most important thing she had ever built wasn't a business. It was the life she was creating for Jordan and Jasmine, a life where respect came first, a life where dignity mattered, and a life where love was never confused with control. Jordan finished his drawing and held it up proudly. 3 stick figures again, Danielle in the center, Jordan and Jasmine beside her. Above them, he had drawn a large sun. Danielle smiled as she looked at the picture, because sometimes the most powerful lesson a child can learn is also the simplest. Never stay where you are not respected, and never forget your worth just because someone else forgets to see it. That was the lesson Danielle hoped Jordan and Jasmine would carry with them long after childhood, a lesson strong enough to guide them through whatever future waited ahead. And as the evening settled quietly around the house, Danielle realized something that made her smile. The story people once believed was about a company had always been about something far more important: respect, family, and the courage to walk away from anything that threatens both. If someone truly values you, they will never make you beg for the respect you already deserve. Danielle learned that silence is not weakness, and real power does not come from money, titles, or being the loudest person in the room. It comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take it from you. So, if this story touched you, remember this. Never stay in a place where your peace is being destroyed just to protect someone else's ego. And if you believe respect should never be optional, type "I know my worth" in the comments, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs the reminder today.